Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome back. As I'm talking, I'm letting people in, so I'm trying to multitask, so I'm failing straight away anyway. Welcome to our new members and our regulars, and tonight we have a lovely talk from Professor Emeritus Berth Danermark. Professor Danermark was at Örebro University in Sweden at the Swedish Institute for Disability Research. He attained his PhD from the University of Uppsala in 1986, titled Class, Income and Housing. He has published prolifically in Swedish and English on various facets of disability method, interdisciplinary research and interprofessional collaboration, and on subjects as diverse as housing policy, drug use, class, social inclusion, representation in education, and even in climate change. He's co-authored Interdisciplinarity and Well Being with Bhaskar and Price 2018, and has also co-authored Explaining Society, Critical Realism in Social Sciences, which is the go-to book, I believe, for new researchers like myself. Tonight's presentation is going to be on critical realist informed social science research. We will have a presentation talk from Professor Danermark, and then we'll have some answering questions after that. So tonight, Professor, thank you very much for joining us. It is greatly appreciated, and we welcome to our network, and we look forward to hearing from you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. And I hope you all hear me and maybe see me also, but that is not so important. Anyhow, I will, I don't know for how long I will talk, maybe an hour or less or more. I don't, we'll see. But I will start my presentation with some short general comments related to the topic of my presentation. First, I would say that when we talk about critical realism and doing research, many of us emphasizes that there exists no critical realist methods. As social scientists, you can use your the whole toolkit, but you have to be aware of for what can I use it and what kind of conclusion can I draw based on the outcome of using different methods. So I will talk more about critical realism impact on how you do research. What do you have to concentrate on? And you can ask, what's the point with social science research? Reality is not transparent, and we cannot observe its powers, structures, and mechanisms, but experience them indirectly, their ability to cause to make things happening. But this is, of course, not specific for social sciences. In physics, we have, for instance, Earth gravity. You cannot yes, please, if anyone can mute. Okay, so you cannot smell, touch, see gravity, but you can see the consequences of it. I will come back to mechanism and causes here later, but the point here is that we as critical realist researchers have to address three domains of reality: the empirical, the actual, and the real. And I suppose as you know what I mean with these three domains. And it's in the real domain we find the structures, mechanisms that generate events. And this distinguishes us as critical realist researchers from other forms of the realist researchers. They focus the empirical domain, but we should not make a caricature of other realists. I see that from time to time, that there are accusations that empirical realists draw conclusions about causality and so forth based only on correlations. I have worked during decades with other realists, and I would say serious researchers, they always look for theoretical explanation for associations and correlation. But it also distinguishes us from social constructivists. But we have to note that there are differences among social constructivists. We have the strong one who totally deny talking about ontology. Ontology is taboo because we have no whatsoever access to an independent world. But moderate social constructivists, they tend to be what we or acknowledge what we critical realists talk about, the transitive and the intransitive object of science. We, as critical realists, we acknowledge that in the transitive dimension, that means our theories, understanding of reality can be fallible, and it's influenced by social conditions, power conditions, and so forth. And moderate constructivists can be incorporated, so to speak, in a critical realist approach. Anyhow, there is a fourth general comment, and that is about the difference between social science, natural and life science. The social science involve different kind of challenges than those of natural life sciences. For instance, due to the nature of social life, the relation between the researcher and the research object is characterized by double hermeneutics. That is, the researcher most often has to interpret other people's interpretation, and this is not the case in natural sciences and life sciences. Another important difference is that natural work structures and mechanisms exist independently of the meaning we assign to them, while in the social world, they are what they are by virtue of what they mean to the members of the society, as Andrew Say put it. So we leave this general comment and I will turn to more practical and concrete issues in the research process. First, of course, what is the problem? Why am I doing research addressing a particle problem? Douglas Porpora writes in his book, which I strongly recommend, Reconstructing Sociology, he writes, we do want to understand how the social world works, and in part, we want to do so in order to create a better world. Why else are we in the field? And this also addresses the meaning that we wish to participate to create a better world that will include relation with practitioners and researchers, and I will come back to that later. So, Andrew Collier, he writes in his book about critical realism that people can be wrong about the way they perceive their own society, and social science can correct them. Indeed, one could argue that that is what social science is for. If society were transparent to its members, we would not need social science. I have to light up here, sorry about that. Excuse me, it's becoming dark here. So we have to distinguish between different types of social sciences. There are at least three different categories as we see it. Research motivated by social scientific theory, trying to identify what the social world comprises, its structures, mechanisms, tendencies, and outcome. And then we have social statistic mapping, in which data are collected about, for instance, extension of different phenomena, for instance, unemployment, and relation between unemployment, ethnic background, education, and so forth. And then we have a more applied social science. We talk about interventions, aiming at solving social problems. I will touch a little bit upon social statistic mapping when I talk about extensive research design. And I will also, at the end of my talk, say something about intervention. But the most part of my talk will be about research motivated by theory, identifying structures, mechanisms, tendencies, and so forth. But in this case, we also have to acknowledge that there is a relationship between social science and social critique. We mostly focus on things which is a societal problem. And when we disclose structures, mainly power structures and other type of structures that contribute to these bad things in society, this explanatory research is by definition embedded in a kind of criticism. And this also leads to some moral issues, axiology, but this axiology is a topic for its own. I will not talk about ethics and moral issue in research in this talk. So, in the beginning of the research, the question of conceptualization and research aim and significant and concrete research question comes to the fore. There are two types of such questions. You have empirical and you have conceptual and theoretical concepts. But without theoretical conceptual concepts, we have no questions. We are using concepts in order to define, distinguish, and discern certain properties of the object. But in order to define, distinguish, and discern certain, and note that, certain properties of the object, because as social scientists, we address problems that are influenced as a huge number of mechanisms and circumstances. It is embedded in a number of different types of structures, and we cannot address all of them. It's not possible. So we have to abstract, and abstraction is conceptual abstraction is, as Andrew Sayed put it, a powerful tool, and hence also a dangerous one if carelessly used. So an abstraction, there is a misconception about the concept abstraction, that it is far from reality, that it is of less use, it's theoretical, it has lost touch with the concrete world, and etc. But that is a misconception. Abstraction is not a way to cover up the complexity. It is a way to deal with the complexity. So we have, as social scientists, to separate or isolate one or a few particular aspects of the concrete object we are investigating. And when we do that, we also abstract from what they abstract from all the other aspects possessed by the concrete phenomenon. And here we cannot do this, as Sayer pointed out, carelessly. We have to do it very careful, so we do only focus on those important dimensions, the important aspects. We isolate certain aspects in thought, and we do that in such a way so we do not throw away the important aspects that constitute the phenomenon we are trying to understand. We have abstractions in social science like class, gender, role, norm, marriage, and so forth. And they are not more vague or unreal than other in natural science. For instance, they talk about air pressure, density, energy, gravitation, and so forth. It is the same thing in social science. So we have to abstract adequate for a specific purpose. We must abstract from particular condition, excluding those which have no significant effect in order to focus on those which do. Even if we are interested in the whole, we must select and abstract their constituents. We have to get away with the contingents and only focus on the constituents. Okay. So that is what we have to have in mind when we start a research project. Even, for instance, if you are investigation domestic violence in marriage, you have to, beside you abstract domestic violence, you also have to abstract marriage, because that is in itself an abstraction. So how do you deal with marriage? Is it a relation? All social science objects are constituted by relations. So you are looking, if you are interested in marriage, you could say it's a relation between husband and wife. You say that is not true in 36 countries in the world, because due to the legal structure at the social level, we also allow marriage between same sex, between man and man, woman and woman. So we cannot abstract it and talk about the relation between husband and wife. We can do that when we talk about marriage in 85% of the other countries in the world, but not, I think, I know Sweden, UK, and so forth. We have to take into account that it is not constituted by different sex. Anyhow, what you call, I don't know what you call two partners in a marriage. You don't call them two husbands, two wives. We had, the authorities in Sweden had a struggle to come up with good labels. And I don't know if you call them spouse or I don't know. Anyhow, we have sorted out that in Sweden, but it was a discussion, a long discussion. What shall we call two married women and two married men? And this also illustrates that when we are doing an abstraction, we also have to realize that it is made up by social relations, and there are a number of relations. We can talk about external relation, internal relation. When we talk about marriage, we have an internal relation between two people. In some country, a marriage you can have between many people in a marriage. A man can marry 10 women and so forth. I don't know if there exists anything the other way around. Anyhow, and you have other type of relation. They can be symmetric. If you talk about husband and wife, there is a symmetric relation. You cannot talk about husband without talking about a wife. You cannot talk about the tenants without a landlord, and so forth. So you you have to take into account internal relations when you abstract, but you also have to take into account external relation. In this case, when we talk about marriage, you have to take into account the legal structure and also cultural structure, social structure. But legal structure is of utmost importance when you abstract marriage, because it's a legal contract and so forth. So we can conclude that social entities or objects are what they are due to the relations of which they are part, and are made up of those relations, but also relations between relations. You have legal relation and you have internal marriage relations and so forth. That means if you separate, isolate aspects, do not do it too narrow. There are necessary aspects that has to be included. If you exclude necessary aspects, you commit the fallacy of carelessly abstraction. So let me introduce in the next step here some key elements in the process of critical realist explanatory research. But please do not be confused, because when you're familiar with Bhaskar's writing, it's not always easy digested. He liked to have acronyms and things like that. And when he talked about different logic of the explanatory research, you came across like RRREIC and DREIC. And when we wrote a book about interdisciplinary, we came up with RRRIREIC and things like that. And that can be a little bit confusing. These R's and these letters stands for resolution, redescription, retroduction, elimination, identification, correction, etc., etc. But I will try to make an overview of these different logics involved in doing critical realist research. A more, I think, I would say, perhaps a more familiar way for you. First, when you enter a problem, we're talking about descriptions. We have to collect data about our topic. So we need a description of the topic. And I said it's very often complex event, situation, and activities we are going to explain. And very often we start with using everyday concepts, and here we always, not always, but very often faces interpretation of persons involved in our research. We have to make interviews, we have surveys and so forth, and their way of understanding the activities. That means we have to address the double hermeneutics. And here we can use both qualitative and quantitative methods to collect data for a description. And then the next stage is that we have kind of an analytical resolution. We come to the phase of conceptual abstraction. we have to distinguish the various components, aspect, dimensions, and level of analysis that we have disclosed in the first description of the phenomenon. It is never possible to study a phenomenon from all of its components. We have in practice confine ourselves to study certain components and aspects, but not others. In this way, we have to more precisely clarify what we aim to explain. And then we come to theoretical redescription. We are looking for various theoretical interpretations, frameworks examined to both specify the phenomenon and explain it in a context of possible explanations. So you are looking for theories that can explain, for instance, if you are looking at domestic violence in marriage, and you have restricted not to partnerships, but to marriages, you have to look for theories that are explaining domestic violence. So we have a kind of theoretical redescriptions. You investigate the state of the art and look for theoretical explanation. And then in this process, you can distinguish between good and bad theories based on the critical realist approach, which can demonstrate truly causality, not claim causality based on just associations or correlations. They have to explain the mechanisms, and if you can choose these theories, these explanations for domestic violence, and then compare, evaluate, or possibly integrate the theory, and then we call it retroduction, when you find answer to the question like, what is a fundamental constitutive for the structures and what mechanisms are related to these structures? So you are looking for structures, mechanisms that can explain domestic violence, if we take that example. And one way to proceed is to ask what must exist for X to be what X is. What is violence, for instance? What can you exclude when you talk about violence throughout the violence, or the baby with the bathwater, so to speak? So, and then you come up with satisfactory answers to questions, and you can find that there are many theories. You are investigating, looking for mechanisms that can explain your topic. Maybe you are investigating domestic violence among female marriages, but you only find research about domestic violence between husband and wives. At least I know in Sweden there exists, to best of my knowledge, no in-depth research about violence in marriages between two women. Maybe you have it in UK, but not. And then you come to the phase of retrodiction. Retroduction, you are looking for plausible mechanisms that could explain. When you do retrodiction, you test if these mechanisms can explain what you are aiming to explain. So there is two logic of research. You are investigating to find the mechanisms that might explain, and then you test, and maybe you come up with the result that the mechanism that explained domestic violence between husband and wife are not applicable to other type of marriages, or you find it is the same type of power structure. They are embedded in the same social structure and so forth. So you have the same type of explanation. I have no idea if that is the case or if there are specific mechanisms unique for this type of marriages. So, and then this retrodiction, you had to go back to, that means you investigate a certain phenomenon at a certain time, at a certain place. And then, so you go back to concrete real world, and very often you have to translate your findings into everyday concepts when you are disseminating your findings. So these are 5 steps we described in our books, and I think you can forget about all these REI and so forth. And I think you are familiar with the process I just described. So I have some papers here, and I found it. So I will now focus on some key issues. I think it's the most important part in critical realist research process, and that is the structural analysis and the causal analysis, because this is what separates us from empirical realist researchers. But first, we have to address the question of levels of reality and emergence. We find too often a reductionist approach in research, because researchers cannot cope with the complexities, so they do careless reductions and end up with I think sometimes very banal and uninteresting results. But there is a type of reductionist approach we have seen now over the last decades, which has had a very strong impact. The first type I have in mind is when the medical technology was developed so you could make brain images. There was an explosion of explanation of social phenomenon reduced to how the brain works. We talked about neurology and things like that. We started to, not we, but it was so common to explain marriage, love, violence, whatever, with the constitution of the brain. But brain is at a lower level than society. So we cannot explain social structures with how the brain functions. But it was so obvious that so many social problems, inequalities on the labor market between man and woman, all that was explained by that the brain was constituted a little bit different from a man, and so forth. The next explosion of reductionist was when we had the Genome Project. We now are confronted with genetics explanation of social phenomena. So there is, for instance, an example which I think some of you have come across. We have done it in Sweden, at least, that we, based on correlation studies, they claim that criminal behavior is caused by genes. I don't know if you come across that. It has, if you, when I go to the literature, I see that quite often. So they based on latest finding in behavioral genetics, some researchers put forward the idea that gang criminality can be explained genetically, claiming that psychological and social mechanisms are of very limited importance. Based on correlate studies, they claim that the environment during, for instance, upbringing plays a very limited role. They argue that these kind of conclusions are further substantiated in molecular genetics through genome-wide associations studies, GWAS. Have in mind, it is based on association studies, nothing about mechanism, nothing. In short, they claim that genes cause criminal behavior based on association studies. That means correlations. But can one really claim that DNA structures and genes are the mechanism that they generate causes the events on the social level? No. A certain DNA configuration cannot cause social events. It can cause the production of enzyme. That is what the gene does. And there is no straightforward relation between genotype, which is inherited from parents, and phenotypes, that is characteristics of a human being. The latter is influenced, of course, it can be influenced to some extent by genes, but also by psychological, environmental factors and so on. It is not possible to claim that criminal behavior, for instance, is caused by genes. The gap between enzyme and making a crime is just too long. There are so many different levels in between. And this brings us to the question of how levels of reality are interconnected, but also differentiated. Entities at a lower level are parts of an object of a higher level. And you, for instance, human beings are parts of the society, but the society cannot be reduced to its part. Emotions cannot be reduced to chemical process in the brain. So society and emotions have emergent properties. Parts of the lower level are preconditions for objects at a how. And they can play a role, but they do not determine social aspects. They are dependent on part of lower level, but the new entity, for example, society emotions, they have causal power that the parts do not have. There is a common example. Take a clock. A clock shows time. If you look at the parts of the clock, none of the parts can tell you time. It is a clock that can tell you the time. That is an example from the technology, but you know, you understand the meaning. So this aspect is extremely important, the emergence that we have different levels and they have their ontological status. They cannot be reduced. It's a part of reality. Levels is not a way we construct the level in our minds. Reality constitutes of different emergent levels. And I will say something about social structure and human agencies. People have the power to act in a certain way, but how they act in a specific context is modified by causal powers of structures at lower or higher level. So structures are enabling and or constraining agency. You cannot do whatever you wish. For instance, take the example, I return to the example of the domestic violence. You might ask, why do women in such a situation leave such a violent relation? I would say that is a wrong question. You pose the wrong question. You victimize the woman. The right question is, what are the structures that prevent a woman to leave such a relation? Because such a situation is embedded in very, very strong economic, legal, nor cultural structures, which make it, can make it more or less impossible, of course, to leave such. For instance, are there sheltered homes existed? It is a question of distribution of resources at the societal level. What will the earning of living be for a person who leave relation, etc. I think you can. So it is important in such research make abstraction so you pose the right type of questions. I have come across that when we did studies about disability and violence, for instance, then we also had to include biological. What type of disability are we talking? Are we talking about people in using wheelchair, or are we talking about intellectual disabilities and so forth? And we always had to also include a biological level. Anyhow, it's important to know that structures and agency are mutually dependent on each other. They are two distinct phenomena. When we talk about disability, it was a shift a couple of decades ago, a radicalization of the movement of the disability. The leading people and the disability movements were very active Marxists, and they totally focused on the social structure. They claimed that disability is caused by society, but later on, so it was a reductionist upwards. They reduced the phenomenon of disability to be a social phenomenon caused by social structures. Of course, you had to take into account also biological and psychological. You have to have the biopsychosocial level. But this reaction was against a medical abstraction of disability, which disregarded the social level and only focused on the body, the biological level. So it became a swing from a biological reductionism to a social reductionism. So there is this interplay between structures and agents, and they take place over time. So you also have to take time into account. Because things are changing, structures are changing over time. That is not the case in natural science, but when we talk about social science, you have to be aware that norm structures, legal structures, and so forth change over time, and that has an impact on the social phenomenon we are discussing. When it became legal to marry same sex, it had an impact on marriage as a social phenomenon. And that is an external aspect of time, but you have also an internal aspect of time. If you take, I return to that because it's a pedagogic example, domestic violence, very often it is an evolution, step by step by step, until it comes to real cruel abuse, sometimes to death. So this way of approaching the question about relation between structure and agents can be summarized. Structure and agency are two different strata with dissimilar powers and properties that structures enable and constrain agents' actions, but agents reproduce and transform structures. So, I think I will repeat that the first step to identify the core is to identify the core problem. Identify the most important research question and include the most important bodies of knowledge that has to be addressed. So, we want to know what these stories tell us about structures, emergent powers, and mechanisms. And we might need expertise from different areas of knowledge. You might not be able to cover all the necessary structures and mechanisms that you have to involve to come up with a meaningful answer to your research question. And that, of course, creates other problem if you have to, not have to, but if you collaborate with researchers that are not critical realists, that I have done from time to time. It's a challenge, really challenge. So we and it's a challenge in many aspects, because when you are doing in-depth analysis, it is through in-depth analysis, we call it intensive empirical procedure, not only qualitative methods, we call it intensive. You go in-depth and ask questions. What produces a certain change? What did the agents actually do? And things like that. These studies are made by methods, interactive, interview, ethnology, qualitative analysis, and so forth. And Douglas Porpora claims that this narrative type of methods is, and I quote, the canonical form of causal explanation. It is in-depth studies where you can disclose the structures and mechanisms. And you need an intensive empirical design to do that. But based on my own experience, you might encounter attitudes that qualitative methods are not pure scientific methods. If you are going to defend a thesis, for instance, and the opponent does not share your idea about ontology and epistemology, you might face the critique that quantitative analyses are not purely scientific. And there are studies made among different types of scientists that really show that their attitude towards this type of methods is that they at the best they can be used as Karl Popper means when he talks about context of discovery, but really true science is a context of justification using quantitative methods, showing that what you hypothesis based on your qualitative research can be justified only by quantitative analysis. But this may bring us to the question, as Dr. Porpora, it's a chapter in his book, do realists run regressions? Yes, we do. Of course, I would say And it's a part of another type of design. We call it extensive way of studying a phenomenon. It is quite often necessary to use quantitative methods, even a critical, realist, informed, empirical analysis. It can be used for descriptions of the phenomenon. How frequent is it? What characterizes it? What is it connected to other types of phenomena? Or what are the regularities and common patterns? And we need different forms of data, large-scale surveys, standardized interviews, register studies, and we use different forms of statistical analysis. The knowledge of these kinds of analysis are sometimes indispensable for further analysis of generative causal mechanisms, but the latter type of analysis, that means on statistical analysis, can never disclose generative mechanism and hence the causality. Statistical analysis deals with observable events and characteristics. And I've been working very much in the field of health. I have very often come across in health research that now we have found a correlation between X and Y, but we do not know the mechanisms. If you read not only scientific literature, but daily news, you can see now we have found there is a correlation between A and B, but we do not know the mechanisms. So the only way to deal with things like power is to analyze the manifestations of power at the individual level. I mention power because power relation is so important in social sciences. Statistical methods cannot analyze causality of power if power is not exercised. And Porpora uses the example of a high school principal who has the power to expel students from the school. Even if this has never happened, he has the power over students because of the social and legal structure that his position as a principal is embedded in. You, in an in-depth analysis, can disclose this type of power. But if you use statistical methods based on empirical evidence, you will not see this kind of power. If you restrict analysis to empirical events like empiricists do, you will not be able to understand and explain many of the phenomena you are investigating. And when I talk about power, it's important to distinguish between two types of powers, or Roy Bhaskar distinguished between power type 1 and power type 2. Type 1 power is a power that is inherent in a structure. For instance, that water, you can use water to reduce a fire. That is a power of that type of phenomenon. But type 2 power is power, he called it master-slave relation. It's power that you use over another person. And these kind of power they can be structural, but they are manifested in individuals' action, like the example of the principal. He can use it and he might not use it, but it is manifested through agents' behavior, and it's important to keep this in mind, that you have to include power in more or less all analysis you are doing, especially if you are doing in the field of crime and violence and things like that. However, extensive design can, despite its shortcomings, be of a great value, as I said. One example of this is that such a design can be used to describe a phenomenon. And I use Professor Terbon's analysis of massive statistical longitudinal studies of inequality in the three key areas of vital inequalities: life expectancy, life's existential conditions, and life resources. The central conclusion he can draw is that the underlying socioeconomic structures give rise to a number of mechanisms that can explain the major differences in all the three areas he described. And his overall conclusion, and that is the title of his book, Inequality Kills. So there is another benefit of extensive research. It can indicate that there might be a causal relation. It cannot disclose, but it can indicate it. Statistical analysis can, for example, indicate common patterns and partial regulation over time. Tony Lawson called these dim irregularities. And because fundamental dim irregularities are often stable over time, for example, gender-related segregation on the labor market, statistical analysis can disclose stable dim irregularity, and it can be a starting point for intensive analysis in order to explain the causality. Anyhow, I will end up with say something about the last step that you might be involved in as a social science researcher. And it is intervention. You might collaborate with practitioners. If you are researching crime, you might be involved with police, you might in other social issues, you might collaborate with social workers and so forth. So once you have come up with some results, they might wish that you should answer them. If I wish to achieve X, what shall I do? But you cannot give him or her an answer to that. What you can do is that you can say, I have disclosed that there are certain structure, there are certain mechanisms, and in the context I studied this, I found that they produce this kind of outcome. That is what you can say. You can educate him or her about important structures and mechanisms. And then the practitioners has to implement that in the concrete context that he is involved in. But here is a dilemma. For instance, when we did research about different form of eating disorders, we come up with the result that the images, for instance, that fashion industry has of the body has an impact, especially on women's eating behavior, and that could result in severe diseases, even deaths. But when we did that together with doctors, with physicians, but they say even if that is an important result, but in my domain of action, so to speak, I have to take action in my what I can do, so I can inform my patients about the fashion industry and so forth. But there is a kind of dilemma, but you have to inform them about your findings. And when it comes to intervention and work to change something, it's a good idea to distinguish between mechanisms that produce the problem, and you can call the other type of mechanism program mechanism. That is mechanism that can deal with this problem mechanism. So you can show the structure and the mechanism that cause the problem, and then you can ask, is it possible to transform and even abolish this structure? And that is, of course, you can try to transform a norm structure, a legal structure, and so forth. But often this takes time, and practitioners usually have a shorter time, what you say, schedule. Anyhow, I can take an example. In Sweden, there was a problem with corporal punishment of children in families. That was legal for, I actually do not remember when the law to forbidding corporal punishment of children, even in families. That was a kind of, they changed the legal structure regarding corporal punishment. And it was a very progressive legislation, because the public opinion was not in accordance with that. It was still a norm in the norm structure that it is right to slap or whatever, to use different kinds of corporal punishment in the upbringing of your children. That is a business for the family. The state should not intervene in the family sphere to have any ideas about that. So it was met with critique, but actually it was a majority in the parliament for that, despite it was not in accordance with the opinion. So after a decade or something, the norm structure had changed. So now, about 25 years later, it is a norm that you should not use that kind of measures in your upbringing. It's not only that it's illegal, it's more immoral, it's not ethical to do that. And even in a country like Italy, my wife and I, we visited a restaurant a year ago, outdoors, and it was a lot of people there. And there was a man who get angry on his children. And he slapped him very hard in the face. And the people in the restaurant, they all stood up and they said, boo! That was a sign of that there are social structures, even in a country like Italy, that it's not the right thing to do. So you have to address and see, is it possible to abolish or transform a structure that contributes to the problem? It is difficult, but you might do that. But you can also do other things. You can try to come up with counteracting mechanisms. For instance, using cocaine as a party drug, that is, at least in Sweden, it's a part of norm structure. It's cool to do. You should do that. How do you address? Can you change this norm? Not that easy. So what can they do? They can create a counteracting mechanism. They can ban the per case possession and use of cocaine. But will an intervention of this kind be successful in changing the norm structure among young people? In Sweden, the answer is no. They have banned it, but despite this banning, the use has increased substantially over the last year. So you can, I haven't done that, but you can, as a critical realist researcher, you can identify the core structures and causal mechanisms, and then try to intervene with partners to change and create counteracting mechanisms. But of course, this raised the question of prediction to end. It is very difficult. If you try to change the world to the better by intervene with some measures, how do you know the outcome? Many critical realists say that prediction, you cannot do predictions because social reality is too complex. But I say, if you know the structures and mechanisms, you can come up with some at least crude type of predictions. And I say that when I talk about intervention, I talk about positive and negative predictions. If you see, based on your research, that the intervention is not addressing the structures and the mechanisms that cause these events, they are focusing on continuous events, you can predict that the outcome will be zero. It will have no important impact, because you do not address the structure and mechanism that cause this. But if you are in a position in a group with people that really intervene and address the either change or create counteracting mechanism, you can at least hope this will have an impact on the outcome and change. And of course, there is a third alternative regarding intervention. You can, if you don't come up with counteracting mechanism or changing structure, there is a third alternative. You can promote something else. You can intervene and implement mechanism that promote something. For instance, if you have identified mechanisms that address people's reflexivity and creativity, it is possible to achieve outcomes, for instance, by promoting a healthy lifestyle in order to increase public health. So that was my last comments in a research process. If you end up with intervention, and if you do that, which I hope some of you at least do, and hopefully you will have some success and the outcome will be a better world. Okay.
Thank you very much, Berth. That was a really comprehensive presentation. Lots of material for me to take away. As you're ending there, I was still writing notes for processing later on. Really like the process of your perception of two types of powers, for instance, and that's something I need to think about. We're going to open it up now for questions, just because for Professor Danermark, English is his second language. Can you just make sure that your questions are nice and slow, please, so we can fully comprehend them? Who would like to start off?
It's not only that.
Okay.
My language. It is not the microphone, but the loudspeaker in my computer is not of a good quality. So please speak slow and clear. Okay,
for Dennis, you'd like to kick off. Would you like to ask you a question?
Yes, I think my question is really related to the maybe both structure and agency input where he made, and it touches a little bit of the intervention aspect Professor Danermark mentioned. I think the reason why I want to ask this question is that today I was just looking at structure and agency interaction, and just from a reflection, a question just popped up, so I wrote it down on my notebook. So I thought it was an opportunity to ask Professor Danermark on that. And the question is, where you differentiate different types of social science for us, it does appear as if social structure and agency interaction is so crucial to whatever structures or mechanism is happening for a particular phenomena, then we should be able to intervene in terms of education, the curriculum that is designed in schools for our children, to learn about these structures and to learn about themselves as future agents, so that the social science domain, which involves interdependent or interaction, can be developed better, rather than teaching people to be independent of themselves, because it makes them to be more selfish in thinking in terms of leadership, rather than learning about how to cooperate or collaborate with each other and develop how these structures emerge. So I was just having that in mind to ask you what your thought is about.
There is actually a Norwegian thesis about the topic you are raising. It's a critical realist. If you email, I can send you the I was one of the what you say, the person who helped the doctorate students. Anyhow, I can give you the title of it, but it's an important issue you're raising. Can school contribute to the awareness of, if you recall my quote from Andrew, that Andrew Collier, that social science, what is about to disclose social structure. So we have to, people have misrepresentation of or misunderstanding about society. So some of them have. I don't say that we as scientists know the best, so we can teach other people, but people have their own conception of reality, and we as researcher that has made in-depth analysis, we can come up with new understandings of mechanisms and structures, as you say. Can that be in compulsory school, for instance? When you go to university, you can choose sociology or social work or other, but I don't know. In Sweden, we do not have sociology as a subject in school. My wife, she was a teacher, and she indeed tried to educate her students at a secondary school about structures, mechanisms, and things like that. So there are individual teachers, and she told me that there were also many of colleagues with her, they had the same approach. But in general, if I look at curriculum, it is not much about what you say about structures, powers, and things like that. But I have another angle to that. And in Sweden, we have annual large-scale surveys among youth. Where do they got their information about the society from? That is not from parents. That is not from school. That is from influencers. And they don't get their worldview from news, from TV or newspapers. They got their worldviews from influencers. And there have been some investigation about what kind of worldview does influencers transmit to their public. It is nothing of what I have talked about today. It is what you say, consumption, selfish, trust yourself, etc. So you are addressing a dilemma, but I'm not sure if it's the school that is the big problem. It might be the influencers that have hundreds of thousands of followers. Look at the riots you had in I won't say UK, it was only in England. I had I talked about that with Scottish French. They said, no, that was not in Scotland, that was in England. And you had very important, as far as I understand, influencers that transmitted, so total wrong information to the public, and they have hundreds of thousands of followers. Maybe this also contributed to the riots. I don't know. Maybe you have investigated that. So I think the issue you raise about the youth, how is it? Can we trust the school? Or yes, we should hope that the school can learn something about the structures, agencies, and so forth to students. But we also have to take in mind that they get their worldview from other sources as well. That was a long answer. I will try to make it shorter.
Thank you, Professor. We'll go to Lars Bros next, and then after that, Flores. Lars, would you like to go with your question?
Yes, thank you for your interesting presentation. I was very interested also in this whole idea of intervention. And I also find it interesting that you pointed out that you have several structures that you need to take into account during abstraction, for instance, the legal structure, but also the norm structure. I was wondering if you have any advice on dealing with contested concepts in society at large. For instance, I'm studying migration. Of course, I take into account the legal definition, where in Belgium we speak of illegal migrants. However, I also see some colleagues who use, for instance, in their publications, the word asylum seeker as a sort of activist stance, but sometimes incorrectly, at least from a legal perspective. So I was wondering, it takes time maybe to change language, and I also think some people might over-exaggerate the role of language, but of course it plays a role. And how would you suggest in dealing with this contested language, as to speak?
I don't really, is it a language issue or is it a social issue about migration? That is your question, concern.
That's a good question. Well, let's say otherwise, if you take into account the legal structures, they might be contested as well. So you still are a little bit caught up in a duality, or at least a multi.
Yes, I think this, of course, they are contested in the sense that there are different types of immigrants from a legal perspective. You have those who have the legal right to come and seek asylum, and then you have those who come only because they cannot find their way of living, the earning of livings in a poor country. So they come just as job seekers, and then you have other, you have relatives coming, you have the concept of unifying a family and things like that. It's a bunch of different concepts that you have to take into account. And I think the public opinion does not discriminate between all these different types of immigrants. And a country needs quite a huge amount of immigrants, because at least in Italy, where I live, and in Sweden, in the future, there will be a huge lack of workforce. So we need immigrants, but it is very difficult to come up with the distinguish between different types of immigrants. That is a legal aspect, but I think that sometimes, at least when I listen to the discussion in Sweden, I can recognize the different levels, the different meanings of it. But if you go to a general public, I'm not sure that you see this. So it's important to constantly highlight these different. But then there is a moral, a norm structure saying that it doesn't matter what kind of immigrant, because within 5 years, the Muslims are a majority and will implement Sharia. I mean, these kind of messages is constantly spread in social media. And that is another type of problem when you talk about non-structures and immigration. So it's a battlefield, many battlefields here, but I think it is important to be very clear what kind of migrants we are talking about. And this distinguish is not done among, not even among political parties, right? Radical right-wing parties. They don't care if it's, they don't acknowledge the UN right of asylum. The whole thing is contested, as you say. I have no idea how to cope with that. There is a discussion in Sweden about UN's right to apply for asylum, but if that is contested, it is contested by the third largest party in Sweden. They say we don't acknowledge that. It is a big problem. I'm sorry I cannot give a clear answer because it is very problematic, and I'm not an expert in human rights and immigration. So maybe
no problem.
There are others who can come up with more constructive comments.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll go to Floris, then Jane, and then Sikia. So Floris, if you'd like to go with your question, please.
Yes, thank you. My internet connection is not super sharp, so if I drop down, please let me know, okay? But so, Professor, I would like to ask you a question from the book Explaining Society. I read it a while ago, and I remember in the book you talk about experiments and experimentation in closed system, and in particular you talk about the experiment of Otto Louis, who tests
and
the nervous system of the frog, right?
The frogs, yes.
Yeah, and then you jump to say, well, this is natural science, right? You can isolate certain powers in an experiment and then plug it into reality and see how these powers operate. And then you go to social science, and there you make the comparison of concepts or making new concepts that they act as experiments. And
yes.
I was wondering if you, because I wasn't completely following there, if you can elaborate on this idea of concepts being experiments.
Yes. I never mentioned the word experiment, but what we say in the book is that you cannot do experiment in open systems. You can only do that when you can close a system. I know that there are psychologists who try to make quasi-experiments and things like that, but we leave that. In social world, you cannot do experiment in the same sense they do in natural science, manipulate one and exclude all impact from others. But what we can do in social science, that is conceptual abstraction. That is, we do an experiment in mind. We exclude things, mechanisms that we do not, that we think has no significant aspect of what we are investigating. So that is what we mean, that our tool to make a kind of experiment is to make conceptual abstraction, what I say. And we cannot do that carelessly, as I say. We really had to exclude things in our mind that is of no significant importance, and just focus on those which previous theories or our findings are coming up with as the most important mechanism. It is of course not an experiment, but it is our way to describe how we can do intellectually, in mind, in theory, by abstraction, doing some kind of an experiment by excluding things. That is, I understand that you see it's a big jump from frog's heart to conceptual abstraction, but if you read it closely, that part, you see that we argue that that is the only tool we have, which we can not call experiment, but do something similar.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jane, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you. My question is a question that I've been struggling with for some time. More philosophically, my interest is in both critical realism as well as phenomenology. And it relates to the idea or the insight in phenomenology that our experience in the world is fluid, and that but whenever we observe an object, there's an intentionality behind it. And I can't quite reconcile how we accept that in phenomenology, that our experience and perception of the world being in that level of fluidity, and within critical realism, that perhaps in the way we search for conceptual abstractions and where we search for it is primarily within the social sciences, but our individual perception as both researchers and the individuals of the objects of research, that question of double hermeneutics includes concepts that are not restrictive to social scientific concepts. So I'm just really would be really interested in your thoughts as to whether you think there is a conflict there, or whether those two positions can be reconciled.
I don't know if my answer will satisfy you or really answer your question. My understanding of critical realism and how critical realist deals with our perception, it doesn't matter if it's a phenomenological aspect, or if you go to the theory of social representation, developed by Moscovich or any other, or pure hermeneutics and so forth, is that, okay, we have to acknowledge the intransitive dimension of reality, which it exists independent of our experience, understanding. It doesn't matter if our understanding is fluent, if it's from a certain perspective or whatever, but it exists something out independent of our understanding of it. And then we have the transitive dimension. That is our understanding of it. It could be based on phenomenology studies or the phenomenology ideology of how we are thinking, how we are approaching experience and so forth. Actually, it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, different forms of experience of the real, of the social reality, can, by judgment, rationality, be related to the intransitive dimension. So some representation you have of the social reality, it doesn't matter from where it's stemmed, can be valued in terms of, it depends on what you are looking for. I'm talking about, can you disclose structures and explain changes in the world? Can you explain outcomes of certain actions? And it depends on your research focus. But I claim that it is possible to compare. I mean, an understanding of the Holocaust as a fake, an historical revision of the history saying Holocaust has never existed, can be compared to a social representation that Holocaust has actually happened. We can make sense of these kind of comparisons and say that one understanding, one perception is more plausible than another perception. That is how a critical realist can answer a question about how different perceptions of the social world, but also the natural world, but of the social world can be approached. It's a critical realist answer. It's not an answer, phenomenologist answer, but hopefully you understand what I mean. I'm not sure if it is satisfied you, but that is how I see the relation between our perception, understanding, and the intransitive dimension.
Thank you. I think being able to unpick and elucidate the contradictions, perhaps even if the methods are different, would be an interesting insight, nevertheless. Thank you.
Okay.
Sikya, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you. And that answer was quite useful for me as well. That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. But it brought up a question for me. When you were talking about abstraction, you said to make sure that your categories aren't too narrow. I may have the opposite problem. So I'm looking at domestic violence, and thank you for all your domestic violence examples. I'm looking at domestic violence among street sex workers. And so with the category that I'm looking at, the relationships are quite broad and probably blurred. So they are intimate partners, not clients, but some of them typically, sometimes they're clients and then they become intimate partners, or they're intimate partners and then they become pimps. So I don't know whether you have any advice, because so I have to keep it broad because some of the relationships are blurred. I don't know whether you have any advice or comments on that. Thank you.
That's it's an interesting note how the agency change depending on, I think it depends on the context. Is it a client? Is it a pimp? Is it a lover? Or is it a friend? Or just a partner? Or whatever. I think when I look at domestic violence related to disabled people, this was a very typical aspect, that sometimes the partner was very, very caring and sometimes very abusive. The role shifted. And how do you explain that? What kind of circumstances, what kind of I mean that as human beings, we have the abilities to act in many, many different ways. So what kind of mechanism trigger a certain type of behavior? I mean, if you act as an abuser, what trigger that? You can say, I'm not sure, you know much more about that than I do, that it was a certain behavior of the partner. I'm not sure about that. It could be something completely different. It could, I don't know, but there must be some mechanism that trigger a certain behavior, and we are as human beings capable to act in many, many different ways. We can be kind, we can be jealous, we can hate, we can go for revenge and things like that. But what are the structures and mechanisms that trigger these different types of behavior? I'm not going to detail what my thought about domestic violence and disability, but we found that there are different mechanisms that triggered different aspects, and human beings are complex. So they can behave very contradictory. You can be so loveful, and next day you can beat the other person very severe. So, but what, I don't know if you have any answer. What kind of mechanisms trigger the different types of behavior?
I haven't got any. Okay, my focus is I'm trying to look at why they don't report the domestic violence that they experience, and what it is that their own understandings of their circumstances, and what it is that how those perceptions are reproduced. Now, I know that certain things will come into play, you know, the stigma attached to domestic violence, and also sex work, and the fact that because of their lifestyle and their proximity to crime, they like to stay away from the police. So all these things will prevent them from going to authorities, to access help. So these are things that I expect to find. I haven't actually started doing the interviews yet, but these are the thoughts that I have on what's influencing them at the moment. The fact that they're quite vulnerable as well, and probably don't have the social networks that, if you like, the larger population of people who experience domestic violence will have. Economic dependence as well. What are they going to do? A significant problem is not having access to resources that maybe the larger population of domestic violence victims or survivors, depending on what language you want to use, will have access to. So, for instance, if a woman is experiencing, severe beating, she can go to a refuge. However, the women refugees will not take sex workers because they're not known for abiding by the rules of the refuge, not bringing in their client, that kind of thing.
So you are interviewing the abused partner, not the abuser. Not the abuser, no. I would like to if I had access to, but I don't know how to access them. No. That's a challenge.
We enjoyed your presentation and lots to take away there. Lots of food for thought for all of us, especially for myself with the 2 types of power, for instance. So on behalf of our CR network, thank you very much for this evening's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.